Started this morning. So hello, good morning. Great to see you all today. Excited for continuing our foundations class. We're going to be, if you're in your notebooks, we're going to be in class number 10. We covered the first half of this class now last week. But what I said last week is we're going to cover like a wide swath because this is obviously very well-tilled soil for us. The story of Joseph. I mean, obviously it's something that we have not just, you've heard probably most of your life, but we literally just talked about and with VBS, and I did a sermon on it. But because of that, because it is very well-tilled soil, I don't want to get too caught up in going chapter by chapter, because again, this class is not about going chapter by chapter through the Bible. It's about kind of reaching the whole story. So we opened a little bit with the Joseph class last week, talked a little bit about Joseph and his situation, and we're going to go ahead and try to maybe finish that today, hopefully. We'll see. But again, I think we got through like chapter 45, and we're going to try to get through the rest of Genesis, the rest of the Joseph story today in this class. And so we're obviously not going to get into every minor detail, but we're going to kind of hit the highlights of what happens next in the Joseph story. But before we do that, Bradley, could you get us started with a word of prayer?
Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this time that we have to read and study about Joseph and your word, dear Lord, and the things that he went through and the ways that we can take that and apply it to our life, dear Lord. And we pray that we have open minds and open hearts and we can absorb your word, dear Lord, and apply it to our lives. We thank you for each and every one here this morning. We ask you to be with those who could not make it for whatever reason, that you may watch over and protect and be with them. Provide for them in whatever way you see fit. And this we ask in Jesus' name.
Amen. So just kind of review a little bit. Last week we were talking about kind of the low point of the Joseph story becoming then the high point where we had the dramatic moments from, we've already talked about his obviously being sold into slavery, his being a slave, going from a slave to a prisoner, but in all these situations still being put in kind of a high place even within these low places. Whether it be a slave, a favored slave in Potiphar's house, to then being even when he was in prison, he was over the other prisoners. And we talked about how he could have gotten very down in these situations. And in these moments, he could have just given up because he didn't see much hope in his situation. Because again, he just keeps going, here's slavery, here's prison. And even though he's in an exalted position in prison, he is still in prison. And he could have looked at himself and said, woe is me, I'm not going to do what I should do. But in all the situations that he was in, he always acted righteously, did the right things, and helped those who were in that situation. And so, real quickly, if you missed last class, number one is Joseph was first a slave and then a prisoner. We talked about that. He was first a slave and then a prisoner. And then even in prison, as I just mentioned, Joseph was put in charge of the other prisoners in this way. And then we also have just talked about how Joseph always acted righteously no matter his circumstances. And we see this in the story of him being in prison over other prisoners because he's over these other prisoners. And even though he could feel very bad for himself, because frankly, is he in a bad position? Yes, he is. But instead, he's looking to the welfare of the other prisoners, so much so that he notices a couple of the prisoners that are under him are exceptionally down. And again, that's kind of a funny thing, because it's like, aren't you in prison? Shouldn't you always kind of be down? But they seem to be especially upset. Joseph goes to them and asks how he can help them. And funnily enough, they are having dream issues because they are having these dreams and no one to interpret them, and who just happens to be their fellow prisoner, but Joseph, to help them interpret their dreams. And we talked last week about how these two men that were in prison with him, do you remember what positions they used to hold in Pharaoh's court before they were prisoners? One was a baker, and the other one was the wine taster, cupbearer, right? Yeah, wine tasters are another word for it. He's not a sommelier, but he's close to that, right? So he is the wine taster, cupbearer, right? That was good. So we've got our baker and our cupbearer. Now, baker, does he get good news or bad news? He gets the bad news, right? The baker gets bad news. So, because the first guy who gets his dream interpreted is the cupbearer. He was Pharaoh's cupbearer. He's in prison now. Joseph interprets his dream and says, you're going to have your position restored. You're going to get out of here. You're going to have your position restored. All good things for you. The baker's like, great. You're going to interpret my dream and tell me the same thing, right? And Joseph's like, you're actually going to die. And he ends up dying very soon. And so the baker dies. The cupbearer gets out of prison. And Joseph says, hey, remember me. Tell Pharaoh about me. But does the cupbearer remember Joseph initially? No. How long does it take for the cupbearer to finally remember Joseph? 2 years. When Joseph had already been either in prison or a slave for 11 years. Would it have been easy for Joseph to have given up? It would have been very easy for him to have done that. But he didn't. 2 more years pass. Pharaoh starts to have bad dreams. The cupbearer clicks in his head, oh wait, I knew this guy. He was in prison. He's probably still there because I totally forgot about him because I'm a bad person. And let me go and tell you about this Joseph guy. Joseph's brought out of the prison, goes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells him the dreams. Joseph interprets it. And what does Joseph tell Pharaoh his dreams meant?
7 years of
plenty, right?
7 years.
7 years of famine, right? And Joseph says, go ahead and store up in the 7 years of plenty, so that way you can have some during the 7 years of famine. And the question gets brought up, well, who's going to be in charge of this? Who's going to be the one who's going to head this project? And Pharaoh says, well, I can't think of anybody better than this guy, because he told me, pointing to Joseph at this point. And so we see that Joseph is always acting righteously no matter his circumstances, whether he was a slave or a prisoner. He does the right thing. And God rewards him by making him second in command of all Egypt, the only person who has more authority at this point than Joseph is Pharaoh himself. And that is that's fill in the blank number 4 for you if you don't have that. So he makes him second in command in all of Egypt. And so we see Joseph go from the favorite son to a slave, to a prisoner, and now the second most powerful person in the world. Because again, Egypt is the dominant power in the world right now. Mostly, by the way, because they can produce so much crops, more than anybody else. And he becomes second in command of the most powerful kingdom in the world. This is for the Greeks, this is for the Romans, this is before all those people. He is a super powerful person at this point. And this is where we see Joseph. But is that the end of the Joseph story? No, we've just reached the pinnacle. Now we're going to see what happens next. So, this famine that then comes, it is prophesied as though it will be a famine, and it's going to affect Egypt, but does it just affect Egypt? No, right? I kind of gave it away with that. It affects the whole area. In fact, I think at one point it says the whole world. This is a really big deal, because not just Egypt was going to be affected, but the entirety of North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond is going to be affected by this famine. Now, Egypt is in a very good position because, of course, did they prepare for the famine that comes? They did, right? Because of Joseph. Did anyone else? No. You know why? Because they wouldn't have known, right? The only reason why Joseph knew is because he could interpret dreams. So they're the only ones stocked and prepared. So when the time comes for everyone to be practically starving to death, where are they going to go to get food? They're going to go to Egypt. And so Canaan especially is the land that we're talking about because, of course, where is Joseph's family still at? They're still in Canaan, right? And so because of this, Joseph's family is forced to come to Egypt to buy grain at this point, which is going to end up being a very interesting thing because we have a reuniting of the family. And so Jacob sends all of Joseph's brothers except for Benjamin. And why would he not send Benjamin?
His favorite.
He's his new favorite, right? Benjamin's his new favorite, his baby. He's already lost his other favorite, so he doesn't want to lose his favorite. So he sends Joseph's 10 other brothers to go and buy this grain in Egypt. So they go to do this. Now, when his brothers get there, they find Joseph, but they don't know that it's Joseph, right? They don't recognize him. And this kind of makes a lot of sense if you think about it. It's been 13 years. It's been a long time for them to not recognize Joseph. And by the way, is Joseph dressed like a Canaanite at this point? Or is he dressed like an Egyptian?
It's all fancy schmancy.
Right? He's dressed like an Egyptian at this point, which, by the way, could also include him like being shaved bald, or maybe not even having his eyebrows anymore and having those painted on. He looks very different, because I'm sure all these guys are probably quite bearded, but in Egypt, hair is not a good thing, especially for those in high positions. You get all the hair shaved off of you all the time. And actually, if you're in a priestly role, you're not allowed to have any hair. If you're in a position of authority, you're not supposed to have any hair. But if you're a common person, you're actually supposed to have hair, and that's a sign of you being of lowly status. Unless you're in mourning, because then you shave. Because there's actually stories about people whose cats died, and cats are very important to Egyptians, and they shaved.
Was that girls too?
That was, yes. Yes, that is correct. Of the noble status. Noble women and priestesses would also be shaved. This is also why we have found mummified remains like this, and depictions of women, high women, are usually bald. So, because again, in their religion, having hair is unclean. So they also have to shave. Which, by the way, they don't have Gillette back in these days. So is shaving a very nice process? No, not really, right? So, kind of interesting. But they don't recognize Joseph because, again, he is dressed like an Egyptian in this way. And so they don't recognize him, but does he recognize them? Oh, yes, he does. He can recognize his brothers even though they don't recognize him. And so Joseph then has a little fun at his brother's expense here a little bit, right? Now, he doesn't do anything devious, because here's the thing. Could Joseph have had all his brothers killed or imprisoned or sold into slavery like he was? Could he have done that? Absolutely. He could have said, finally, revenge. I was enslaved and in prison for 13 years. Guess what's going to happen to you? The same thing. But does he do this? No. So when we see this next event that kind of occurs here, let us understand that this is Joseph kind of messing with his brothers a little bit, but this is, at the end of the day, kind of playful. It could have gotten action. If he was actually mad, he could have done a lot worse, right? So just understand that during the story. So Joseph sees an opportunity, mess with his brothers, and he takes this opportunity. The first thing he does is, once he sees them, he immediately accuses them of being spies. You're spies here in the land. You're coming here to spy for our enemies to come and take us over. And they're like, what are you talking about? No. We're not spies. And so they start giving him all the information. They're like, yeah, we have a father. We have a younger brother who didn't come with us, all these kind of things. And Joseph says, oh, do you now? You have a father and a younger brother. Well, I think I want you to bring your younger brother to me. And at this point, of course, the brothers are having internal panic, right? Because does the father want Benjamin to come? Will the father do everything in his power to make sure that Benjamin does not come? Absolutely. So now they know whenever they have to leave Egypt, it's going to be a big fight when they get back to Canaan to bring Benjamin. And again, by the way, we talked about this when Joseph originally got sold into slavery. Is this a short trip? In the age of donkeys and horses and such things, wagons, a 200 to 300 mile trip, which is about what they had to experience, would have been quite a long trip. So do they want to make this trip back and forth? No, they really don't, right? But they come here to get this one time to show kind of how desperate their straits they're in. So they go and they get the grain here, but again, Joseph is going to kind of mess with them. So Joseph demands they bring back the younger brother, Benjamin. And that's number 6 on your fill in the blank. He demands that they bring back Benjamin when they leave. And we see this whole kind of back and forth, because he says, okay, if you don't bring back Benjamin, because immediately once he asks, hey, you're going to need to bring back your younger brother Benjamin, they're all like, no, we can't do that. And he's like, well, you're going to kind of have to do that, because I'm going to take Simon and I'm going to hold him hostage until you come back here with your other brother. So he holds Simeon. They keep hold of Simeon, not Simon. Not Simon says. Simeon, until they return back with Benjamin. Well, they go back to Jacob at this point, minus Simeon, and they're like, hey, we need to take Benjamin. Is Jacob going to be for this? We just talked about how he was not going to be, right? So they return later with Benjamin after a fight. When you read into the text, you see that they are in desperate straits at this point, right? To the point where they seem to be on the breaking point of starvation. Because the oldest brother, remember who the oldest brother is? Reuben, right? Reuben is like, hey, we could have already been there and back by now, but you keep holding us up because you won't give us Benjamin. And Jacob, by the way, is mad with the brothers. They're like, why did you even tell this guy that you had a younger brother? And they're like, well, he accuses us of being slaves, and so we just started fessing up to everything and anything that we could possibly have done at this point. And so eventually, whenever Jacob realizes that everyone's going to die if he doesn't let go of Benjamin, he says, okay, fine, you can take Benjamin. And when Benjamin comes, Joseph is so overwhelmed by seeing Benjamin that he actually has to leave the room because he was crying. So what happens is the brothers get there. He has them sat down for a feast. The Egyptians are in a separate room because Egyptians thought everyone who wasn't Egyptian was unclean, right? So they have to eat in a separate room. And here's Joseph and his brothers. He sees Benjamin get so overwhelmed, and he has to leave the room, excuse himself, because he weeps because of his love for Benjamin. Why does he love Benjamin so much more than his other brothers? I don't know. Probably because Benjamin's the only one who didn't sell him into slavery, right? But he has this deep affection for Benjamin, and we see the emotions that Joseph is experiencing at this point. Now, here's where Joseph continues to kind of play the game here a little bit. So they eventually now obviously have to leave, right? Okay, they have to go. And they take some grain with them, and they're ready to depart. But Joseph has a plan. He puts one of the I believe it's a silver cup, into one of the bags of grain. And of course, it wasn't just anybody's bag. It was Benjamin's bag of grain. Because this is an excuse for him to keep Benjamin. So he had this cup put into Benjamin's bag. And it was an excuse to keep him. Because whenever they started on their journey, that's when Joseph said, okay, send some guards, go look for this cup, and especially check this guy's grain. Well, obviously they go, and what do they find? The cup that Joseph had put into the grain bag in the first place. And of course, at this point, all the brothers are freaking out because they're like, our father would prefer all of us just die than for us to go back without Benjamin. Okay, you have to understand that. Because they're brought before Joseph at this point, and they're just pleading for him to let go of Benjamin. Because they're like, our father literally does not care about us compared to Benjamin. He would rather us never return than to not see Benjamin again. And finally, at this point, Joseph is done playing his game. He's kind of done all the stuff back and forth, but it's at this point as they're begging for them to spare Benjamin that he reveals himself to his brothers. That's the next, fill in the blank on number 8. He reveals himself at this point to his brothers and tells them to bring everybody to Egypt at this point. Now, it's kind of, like I said, it's kind of a fun back and forth that happens on Joseph's side. The brothers would have been freaked out throughout this entire event, but it ends very nicely because not only is Joseph able to reconnect with his brothers at this point, and most specifically Benjamin, but he's also able to get his father back, Jacob. And by the way, how sweet is this for Jacob? To have a son he thought was dead for 13 years, whom he was mourning for 13 years, be restored to him at this point, right? Now, this moment's going to have a lot of consequences, right? Because the Hebrews are going to walk into Egypt free, but are they going to remain that way? No, they're not, right? They're going to be enslaved in a few generations, right? But everything seems very fine at this point, right? Because they are under Joseph's protection. Joseph is in very high command. Joseph's in a great position here at this point to help them. Any questions so far about anything we've talked about? Okay, let's turn, if you wouldn't mind, or real quick, let's turn to Genesis chapter 50. Being Genesis chapter 50. Actually, we're going to go back a little bit. Yeah, let's do, hold on, let me see exactly where we're going to go. You can just stay in the back half of Genesis here. That brings the family. Goshen. Okay. Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, Genesis chapter 50, we'll do that. Starting in verse 1, we'll read it in our traditional style, so I'll start with verse 1. Jay, could you read verse 2, and then we'll keep going verse 3 through all the way back to, before it gets back to me. Good to go? Okay. Start in verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him.
And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel.
40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days.
And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying,
My father made me swear, saying, Behold, I am dying. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will be back.
And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. No, wait, I went too far.
So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt,
as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Excuse me. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen.
And there went with them both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company.
And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan, and they lamented there, or
Lamented,
not laminated, sorry, lamented there with a very great and immense lamentation.
Yeah, you got it.
And they observed 7 days of mourning for his father.
When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named
It is beyond the Jordan.
Sorry, it is beyond the Jordan.
Yeah.
Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them.
For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah, to the east of the Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place.
After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him.
So they sent a message to Joseph saying, Your father gave this command before he died.
Say to Joseph, Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression. What is it?
Oh, you're good. You're good. Yeah, you did skip me. It's okay. Yeah, we're good. No. He skipped me, not you. You're fine. Yeah. I had my mouth open. I was like, and then I was like, I'm just gonna let it go.
That's what I was thinking
Yeah,
about.
you go ahead, Amanda. I think you're right there in the middle of 17.
And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him.
I'm not going to let you take 18 now.
Okay. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants.
No. But Joseph said to them, Do not fear, for I am in the place of God.
But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive.
So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them.
All right, that's good. Thank y'all so much for reading that. Okay, so important section for two different reasons. So number one, so we see that Jacob, also called Israel at this point, the father of Joseph, brings the whole family to Egypt, and they have to settle in the land of Goshen. Now, is Goshen a very good place to live?
No.
So it's kind of away from Egypt, again, because the Egyptians, thinking themselves a much higher society than everybody else around them, believed that these Hebrews, even though they were Joseph's family, did not need to live among them, right? So they settle out to Goshen, which ends up becoming a good and prosperous territory. But originally, it was not a great place to be, right? God blesses the land of Goshen when the people of Israel are in it. But originally, they kind of have to be put away. Now, as Jacob ages, he's already quite old at this point, but as he continues to age, before his death, he blesses Joseph again, and he blesses Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which those are going to be very important names to remember because they are going to be part of the 12 tribes of Israel. When you look at the 12 tribes of Israel, you're like, where is Joseph? Because you think it's named after the 12 sons. Well, it's not, because Joseph is excluded, but his sons are added in instead, Ephraim and Manasseh. But that's a whole other thing we'll get into later. But then Jacob dies, and it's kind of interesting, because what does Joseph do with his father's body? He embalms it, mummifies it, right? Is that a Canaanite thing? That's an Egyptian thing. So, is Joseph really kind of counting himself as an Egyptian now?
Yeah.
Yes. But here's where his situation is kind of interesting. Does he bury his father in Egypt?
No.
No. He takes him back to Canaan to bury him in the same cave where Abraham is buried and Isaac is buried, right? The same place there. Now, as they go, Joseph asks permission to leave from Pharaoh, but it's kind of interesting that he has to ask this permission. But again, he is under Pharaoh. But who all comes with Joseph? Is it just his people? No. No. We're told Pharaoh's household guard went up with him, and all his kind of retainers and stuff. So, how much does Pharaoh favor Joseph? That not only is he just like, yeah, you can go and bury your father, I don't care. He says, let me send with you pretty much my entire retainer with you to go and do this. But not only has Joseph become a little Egyptian, you also see how much care Pharaoh has for Joseph, that he would be willing to part with all these people to go with Joseph. And by the way, whenever they enter into Canaan, is it just Joseph that mourns his father's death?
No, it's the Egyptians too.
It's told the Egyptians as well, right? In fact, they named a whole town after Joseph, or after the Egyptians mourning with Joseph at the death of Jacob. Very interesting. How much does he mean to the people of Egypt? Not just to Pharaoh, but to the people of Egypt.
They probably see him as a savior.
I mean, you would think so, right? Because if it were not for Joseph's presence,
They'd be starved.
yeah, would they have survived? Would they still be this powerful nation? They wouldn't, right? In fact, most of them would be dead. And so they have a very high reverence of Joseph, to the point where when Joseph hurts, they hurt. And they care as well. Which again just shows the impact. Every place that Joseph is, he has an impact. And I think this is something that's kind of important for us to remember. What kind of impact do we have in a place? Are people happy to see us go? Are people happy to see us mourn and upset? Or do people mourn with us because we leave such an impact on them that they care and love us in that way, right? I think there's something to be said for that. Not saying that everybody's going to love you and appreciate you all the time, but I'll say this. There's people that walk into a room and I'm made much happier by their presence. There's people that walk into a room and my peace is immediately stolen, right? Because of who they are, right? We all have people in our lives like that, right? We all do. Let's be one of those people who brings peace brings joy, brings excitement, not somebody who steals peace. And I think that's what Joseph's situation is here, right? I think there's something to that. But he buries Jacob, also Israel, named Israel, in the cave where Abraham is at. He would have been the only mummified body in there. But he does this, goes back to Egypt. Now, something very interesting happens. So he goes back, Pharaoh's family goes back, the Egyptians go back, and Joseph's brothers begin to be worried. Let's keep going. So, hold on. That's giving away some information here. So Joseph's brothers worry because they think, well, Joseph was very nice to us. He's invited us into the land. He's taken care of us so far. Yeah, he messed with us a little bit, but he really hasn't repaid us evil. That day's coming, and it's probably coming soon now that Jacob is dead, because I'm sure he wasn't trying to do evil to us while Jacob was alive. But is Jacob alive anymore? Is their protector in this way alive still? He's not. So they start to get worried. They're like, we got to figure something out. Let's just throw ourselves at Joseph's feet and tell him that Jacob wanted us to be protected even though we did evil against him. Which, by the way, did Jacob ever say any of these things?
Did he ever even know?
No. Well, that's the thing. We don't necessarily know how much he knew about this whole situation. I'm imagining he probably figured it out because he was like, how'd you end up in Egypt? And then they had to tell the whole story. But Jacob didn't say any of the things his brothers said that he didn't say any of these things to his brothers that they're telling Joseph that he said. This is just a bald-faced lie to try to save their own skin at this point, right? A desperate attempt nonetheless. And they bow down to him and say, we are your servants. Which, by the way, very interesting, right? Because what was the prophecy that Joseph had whenever he was 17? That they would bow down to him, right? And they would be his servants. Well, guess what? Here we go. A fulfillment of what was said. But how does Joseph take this? Does he say, okay, fine, you're my servants, you're my slaves, I'll put you in prison, I'm going to do to you what I need to? Is that what he does? No, he doesn't do that, right? Instead, very interesting pause, the first thing he does is not say anything. The first thing he does is weep, which again shows the heart of Joseph here. He weeps that his brothers would even feel like they need to do all this, but he weeps. And then he says this line, which is great. So he assures his brothers that God meant what happened for good. But this line, which is what Micaiah read, was really great, which is verse 19, chapter 50. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? That's a really big statement. Because in effect, what he's saying there is that, is justice in my hands, or is it in God's hands? He says it's in God's hands, which is a big thing to say. Because how easy would it have been for Joseph to have taken vengeance on his family, on his brothers? It would have been so easy. He's second in command of Egypt, most powerful kingdom in the world. He's got an entire nation who weeps with him when his father dies. If he told the nation, dismember my brothers and cast their members to the wind, they would have done that for him easily. Was Joseph in a position to take revenge? Absolutely. To get justice, you might even say. But does he take it? No, because he says, I'm not the one who's supposed to be taking vengeance, justice. That's for God to do. Which, how powerful of a lesson is that? Because, man, do we want to take revenge in our lives? Man, do we want to take justice into our own hands at times?
Well, the Bible teaches us what happens when we have so-called enemies and we do good to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's like heaping coals upon
It's burning coals on their
and
head.
that's exactly how they're feeling right now.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph never asked them to be his servant.
Yeah.
They decided that
Mm-hmm.
because of their own fear for revenge.
Yeah.
Like, we better do this, we better bow down, but you put yourself in that position.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's correct. Because Joseph didn't ask them to for them to be made servants. No, they were trying to do that themselves to get out of their own way, right? And to save themselves. But Joseph says, I'm going to leave this to God because it's up to God. And by the way, in all these moments, he sees the value of what God did. Because here's the thing. He recognizes, I'll get back to that. He recognizes that they did an evil thing to him. But how many hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people were saved because Joseph was in Egypt before the famine and made these plans so that way not only Egypt would be saved, but the entire surrounding area would be saved? How many generations were saved because of Joseph? He says, yeah, I had to experience 13 years of incredible hardship, and he did. And yet, at the end, he sees the value of it all. He sees that God's hand was with him, even though really evil and terrible things happened to him. And I'll end on this, and this is I probably should have left us a little bit more time to ask this, but I think this raises an interesting question. Does God cause bad things to happen to us, or does he allow them to happen and uses them for his goodwill? Right? I'd agree with y'all. I would say he allows these things to happen. Because again, our God is not evil. Our God has no evil within him. Is God going to cause an evil event to happen? No. But will he allow events to happen but shape things with his hand for good? Yes. Because did God cause Joseph to be sold into slavery? No, but did he allow Joseph to get sold into slavery? He did allow Joseph to get sold into slavery. And did he cause Joseph to be falsely accused and go from being a slave to a prisoner? He did not cause it to happen, but he allowed it to happen. Because eventually it led him to what was going to happen, which is a saving of millions of people and generations of people. By the way, as well with this, the sacred line went from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to the 12 brothers. Does that line end if Joseph isn't sold into slavery?
Probably, because they'd be starved.
They would starve to death, right? Even if Joseph would remain the favorite son in Canaan, all things being good, once that famine hits, they would have nowhere to turn to because Egypt wouldn't have prepared beforehand and everyone would have died. And so God's promised bloodline, his promised plan to go through the nation of Israel would never have come about if it weren't for this event. Go ahead, Bradley.
It also makes me wonder, instead of going through all that, why didn't God just say, we're not going to have a famine, don't worry about it.
Well, I think there was a plan in place. And I think that's why we need to look at these things and you say, well, why did God do it in this way? Well, we don't always necessarily know. But what we do know is whatever he does is the best way.
Absolutely.
And that's where we go, like, could we think of maybe a cleaner way that this could have all kind of turned out? Maybe. But there seems to be a clear reason why God had did what he did. We don't necessarily always know it completely. But his will is shown here. And also, by the way, I think his will is shown here by the people of Israel beginning in Egypt, being slaves under Pharaoh before being released, and the impact that then that had on the nation of Israel from this point forward. I think that was another part of this as well. But we'll get into that. That's for another class. So next week we'll talk about the Exodus story. We'll get into that. Thank you for finally finishing Genesis with us. We're 10 classes in. We're finally finished with Genesis. I promise we're probably going to go a little bit quicker going forward. It is a lot. Well, and it's if this is a foundations class, I mean, there is no more foundational text really to the Bible as a whole than the first book that is the Genesis of all things. And so, like I said, we're probably going to move a little bit faster going forward, but we really had to hit these highlighted characters, which is Adam and Eve, to Noah, to Abraham, to Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12 tribes. So we'll go from there later. But thank you all. I'm going to pray real quick. I'm going to go ahead and shut off this live stream. Bye for you. Oh, it's not a live stream, but the recording. And I'll get that